Hello, I'm Pastor Sherman Bradley.
And I'm Pastor Sidell Bradley.
And today is day
6
of our experience in Israel. And it has been an awesome time with you sharing where we've been and what we've been going through.
Now, on this particular day, it was the Sabbath, which the Jewish people call Shabbat. It's the day that's holy for families to come together to worship, to sing, to pray. And it's an observance that is in the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's talking about how 6 days the Lord worked, and on the seventh day, he rested. And so this is a really great practice for families to come together, to enjoy one another over a Shabbat meal. We didn't get to go to one, but everything shut down, and our tour shut down at about 2:30.
Yes, and they would even dress up for this. This is a big deal. It's not just a meal. It's a meal of coming together, honoring their role as a family together, worshiping as a family, and then sharing stories, things that are important to them and their walk of faith. It's a marvelous experience and one that brings them closer together.
I wonder if you and your family take a weekly time together to eat a meal, to share your stories, and to worship the Lord. I think it would be a great practice for many of us who are Christians as well. So on this day, we went back to the Mount of Olives. We mentioned before that at the bottom of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane. We showed you some examples of some pictures, but we're going to show you even more pictures of these trees, olive trees that used to be all through the mountain that are 900 years old.
Yeah, 900. And they are unique, not just because of how old they are, but if you were to see them, and I believe we have some pictures, and if we don't show them, then you can just reach out to us. We'd love to share them with you at a different time.
We have pictures. So this is Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus was praying, Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And we happen to be, as we're making this video, in this Lenten season where people are deciding to fast, to pray, to give up something for Lent, to identify themselves with Christ's passion, his suffering. And we thought about how the anguish of his soul was happening way before the actual cross. He had to consider it. He had to talk to his disciples about it. And then he prayed to his Father, if there was any way possible, don't let it happen.
Now, I believe this is where we then transitioned into the Church of All Nations.
Yes, it's right next to.
A beautiful building. I mean, we've been saying that each day with each video that we've shared, but you have to see these places for yourself.
Now, this Church of All Nations was actually made by about 12 nations around the globe, coming together and wanting everybody, Isaiah talks about and Jesus reiterates that God's house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. And this particular church really exemplified this. But there was something really interesting about the church. At the top of the church, there were 2 bronze deer and a cross that they were both looking at. And they said to us that this represented Psalm 42:1. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you, O God. So it's truly a place of worship. It's truly a place where people come together from every tribe, language, people, and nation, worshiping before the throne of God, like is in Revelation.
Yes. On the side of the building as well, at the very top, there's a lion, the head of a lion. And I just thought about King David and the representation of the Lion of Judah as I watched and thought back as to how important these symbols are to the faith then and then still for us today.
So then from there we went to Mary's tomb, which is also called the Church of the Assumption. And this is supposed to be, at least some of the Catholics, Greek Orthodox believe that this is the location where Mary's tomb is, even though there's no mention of Mary's tomb in the scripture. So we went down. It was like this beautiful building again, and you're going down all of these dark steps. And they have like 4 altars there, but the main ones that we saw were the Greek Orthodox Church and the Armenian Church. And so you saw the priests, and apparently they do this, I guess, all day and maybe all night, I don't know, but worshiping at these altars. And then they had this kind of incense, and they would walk around with the smell of incense. And then, the Armenian group would do what they were doing, and you could hear the different prayers in the different languages. Yes. And it was a really fascinating thing. We stayed there for quite some time.
We did. And it's beautiful as you watch the different expressions of their faith, a lot to do with their ethnic traditions and how they are exhibiting it, and the freedom that they gave one another to do so. And we got to participate, well, as spectators, we got to experience it as well.
It's very important for particularly the Catholic Church, as we're dealing with like a pluralistic society where we're looking at all these different expressions of religion. The Catholic Church really using Mary as a symbol, wanting to make sure that Mary's birthplace, Mary's tomb was going to be recognized. And so this was very, though it changed hands, the Crusaders had this place at one point, and now it's with the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholics and the Armenian Church. There was as you go up the steps, there was a bench that was representing her actual tomb. And so people in Israel are really trying to kind of like lay claim to all of these historical sites.
Yes.
So the next place that we went to was back to the area of the Temple Mount. It's called the Davison Center. It's like an archaeological museum, and it also has the renovated temple there.
Yes.
And so you go there and you see some, pictures and photographs of all the iterations of First and Second Temple, and it tells you the history, and they have these remakes everywhere. But we were able to go to the steps of the temple, see some of how it was built.
And what's there that's still remaining is fascinating. And on this, was it the northern side of the wall, where we looked down upon where they had the multitudes who came to hear Jesus, who were at the base of the Kidron Valley, where you could then begin to sense how one person could speak to so many and they all hear. The landscape is set up for that. Now, it is not an easy journey, especially back in that day. It was challenging for us, even in this day, with shoes on, even with what is being set up to further assist us being able to walk and experience the lay of the land there. It's fascinating. You have to see it for yourself.
We saw some places where, about the building of the temple itself, there were these huge bricks. That were blocks, were 9 feet.
Yeah.
And they showed the apparatus upon which they were carried up and in and put up. And they were 9 feet long, and it was so heavy that they didn't even have to use mortar. And so you watched and you're wondering, and I asked, hey, did slaves do this? How did this happen? And they said, no, it was the people of Israel who were worshiping the Lord and wanted to build the temple themselves. We also went up the temple steps, and it reminded me of the Psalms of the Ascent, where you're rising up into the presence of the Lord. So some of the steps were the original brick, and some of them were kind of remade, but we were able to kind of go up. And you think about Psalm 24, who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who will stand in his holy place? He that has clean hands and a pure heart. And so we were thinking, and we were praying, and we're going up these steps. We're seeing the places where the animals were sacrificed and the blood would run down the hill. It was really a very holy place that we got to kind of walk around for some time and to imagine millions of people, and you're thinking about the sounds that might have been heard as the animals are slaughtered, the smell, the stench of it. There were baths, ritual baths everywhere, and you think about how people had to be ceremonially clean in order to bring these sacrifices to the Lord. And so it was a real experience going into that remodeled temple.
And it gave a new sense of grace to the process of sacrificing animals, because when you think about today, anytime you get that close to blood, we are washing and cleansing. We have protocols and processes to make sure that that blood's not being transferred to someone else, or that you don't take it with you home. But when you're doing that many animals, that many people handling it, to still have the kind of purity that came with it. There's just such a tremendous amount of grace that God extended his children during this practice and this celebrating and commemorating what they were doing for the Lord.
We'd already talked to you guys about how we went to the Wailing Wall, which is kind of on the other side of this area, and how we were both able to go and to pray. Those areas were segregated by men and women, and we were able to put our prayers inside the wall.
Yes.
And so now we're coming on the other side, and we're thinking about how those people were singing these psalms as they were going up into the temple, and they were getting closer to God as they ascended. So all of this was a very, very holy place. It took more than one day for us to see all of this.
Now, one quick point too, we found out this time that it's foreigners who call it the Wailing Wall, but in Jerusalem they call it the Western Wall.
So then we're still in the old city of Jerusalem, and we're going to get lunch in the Jewish quarter. And we talked about how this area is set up in quarters, the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Islamic quarter, all of these quarters and these sections where there's food, where there is commerce going on. And so it's really interesting, this juxtaposition of the holy sites and this kind of marketplace of the merchandising. And so we're there getting lunch in the Jewish quarter, and we found a place that was a burger joint, but we don't eat meat, so they also had Impossible burgers
and sweet potato fries.
And sweet potato fries, which was great. I know you guys are like, you're going out of the country. We did eat a lot of stuff at dinner that was, germane to the area.
Yes.
But on this particular day, we were like excited to get an Impossible burger. It was wonderful. And in this quarter, there was a giant menorah, which is a candelabrum, that was 6.5 feet tall, which Sherman is 6'1", and so it was about here. And then it was gold plated.
Yes.
95 pounds of gold plated. This menorah, which is 8 kind of candlesticks, it was a form for worship. The actual first one, the tabernacle, was made of pure solid gold. And so this was a figure of worship. Maybe you guys have heard of Hanukkah. Those menorahs, that candelabra has 9 actual candlesticks because of the miracle of the olive oil, because all of them are lit by the olive oil, and the olive oil holds the flame. And a miracle was that the olive oil held the flame for 8 days when it was only supposed to hold it for 1. And so we got to see this huge, the menorah is an emblem of Israel. So when you get your trinkets and that kind of stuff, your keychains and all that, you'll see the menorah on it. And so we had lunch there in the Jewish quarter, and there was the menorah. The menorah symbolized God's creation, in 7 days, and then on the 8th day, God rested. On the 6 days, and 7th day, God rested. It is a beautiful, and it's encased in this acrylic that you can't go in.
It's almost like a dome over top of it.
A dome over top of it. So then we went to the canticle. The canticle is the room where Jesus had his Last Supper. Otherwise known as the upper room. This is where Jesus had the Last Supper, and he knew that one of his disciples was going to betray him and pointed him out in this upper room, and several other things happened in the canticle.
Yes, it is actually the place where the Holy Spirit fell upon them on the day of Pentecost, and it is the place that they came out from to meet the community that came out to them after they heard this mighty rushing wind and this sound coming from heaven. Just to be there and think on those experiences just give you chills in that moment.
It's the place where Jesus washed the disciples' feet.
Yeah.
It's the place where the disciples gathered after the ascension. So here's Jesus coming back into this room. A lot of times we're thinking all these things happen in such separate places, and they all happen in this small jurisdiction. Yes. And even after Judas committed suicide, and they were going to pick. They cast lots for a new apostle. Matthias was brought on board in this upper room.
Yeah.
Mechanical. And then, finally on that day, we went to worship at the Garden Tomb. We already talked about before that we had gone to what people believe is the actual place of Jesus' death, where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was lying. We showed you that spectacle when we went there to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We talked about that in one of the earlier videos. And today we went to, it was kind of like, not a replica, but I guess it was a replica.
Yeah,
of what those tombs at that time would be like. Because when we talked about the Holy Sepulchre, now they had made it a shrine, had all this iconography, and they had this, Greek Orthodox people kicking you in and out of it. It was a really interesting, because, there's so many people in line, they wanted to get everybody going, in and out of it. And it was covered and enshrined and all of that, but this was more like an actual tomb that you would experience. So it was more like a historical experience.
Yeah, more of a landmark commemorating the occasion. Mm-hmm. And so we could go in, and there was literally a garden area in this cordoned off area. And then there's this rock wall, so to speak, that we could go into just a couple at a time, where they believed that this could have been the actual tomb. Now, this was a much bigger space than the first location that we went, that we're told more likely represents how they were creating tombs back in that day, which was much, much smaller. I literally had to crouch down to get into, but this was something for us to behold as well.
And they had a stone which they had rolled away, so that you could really imagine, the people who own this particular location are not necessarily claiming that this is the accurate spot, but just wanted you to get a different idea than all of the splendor and stuff that you saw at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
So true.
On this actual trip as well, we were introduced to Golgotha, which we know as Calvary. I know that when we sing, Old Rugged Cross, we say, on a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, but actually it was kind of more like on the street in a valley stood the crosses. Right. And so it was a place where people in public saw the crucifixions. Crucifixions were kind of like their capital punishment. And so criminals, Jesus went on this trial before Pontius Pilate. He went on a trial with the Sanhedrin and was found guilty. They freed Barabbas and they took Jesus. And we saw this place, which was like a busy street it would have been. So all the carrying of the cross that we talked about on the Via Dolorosa into this place of Golgotha, it's called the place of the skull. Yeah. Because the place of the skull is this rock impediment, I don't know if that's the right words, and you could see almost like an eye, two eyes, a nose, and a mouth that resembled a skull. And so they said it was called the place of the skull.
And they have, to give even greater context to what she just said, an old photo that's black and white that was taken much longer ago, that gives a more visual representation of the skull than what you see today because of erosion that has happened. It's really interesting, but again, we are speculating, but just to be there is an experience you want to have for yourself.
Now you can imagine, if you use your sanctified imagination, a big city, let's talk about, a city like New York or something like that, where commerce is happening and people, are at that time coming and going, and they're seeing criminals being punished in front of their very eyes. They're watching them carry their crosses. They're watching the Roman soldiers put them on the cross. They're watching and they're hearing the flogging. They're hearing the sound. They're hearing the weeping. They're crying out and saying, "Crucify him." It's all public spectacle. So when we think about Jesus, not just the physical things that happen, the cat of nine tails with the lashes and the shards of glass and the steel that's ripping off his flesh, but now also the public humiliation of his clothes being torn and his beard being ripped, and the cries and the anguish, and him not being able to lift his cross on his own, and then it happening, and all this happening in front of the entire city, and him doing all of that just for us.
Yes. And you can imagine Mary and John being at his feet and watching this play out up close and personal. And all of what this represented as he hung his head and willfully gave up his life for you and for I.
You also remember that there is 2 thieves on the cross. And those thieves had an opportunity to accept him as Messiah. Even without baptism, one of them was told after he believed, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And so even on the cross, even in this anguish, even in all the physical, the asphyxiation, all the things that Jesus was dealing with, he still, as Lord and God, had the love to bring someone who didn't know him, someone who was a criminal, someone who really before this wasn't even thinking about their relationship with God, ensuring that they would be reconciled to God and to experience heaven.
Yes.
So this was a wonderful day.
How marvelous is that?
And so at the end of the day, we went back to the Grand Court Hotel, and we had some of the Shabbat dinner offerings. Again, because we generally don't eat a lot, we had fish, but at least one of the meals you have to have bread. We think about Jesus being the bread of life. We think about communion. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And so all of these things that we're learning about Judaism, that we're learning about this location, all for us as Christ followers, point back to Jesus, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, all for loving the world and loving us.
Well, this has been another edition of our trip to Israel. There's going to be more.
Yes, there is.
We've seen so much, and we're glad to be able to share it with you as well. We'll see you again soon.